everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Jennifer. In this video, I'll be showing you how I made this supersized candy cane inspired by a picture I saw on Pinterest. If you haven't been following along, this is part of my Christmas countdown series going on right now. So check out the other crafts I've made so far if you haven't already. And if you're interested in making one of these candy canes for yourself, stay with me and I'll walk you through each step. I started with this 4x4 post, which is actually 3.5 by 3.5. You're going to need at least 8 feet. Mine is a bit over that, which gives me a little leeway to work around the natural knots in the wood. I will include a complete cut list in the description of this video for your reference. I took a look at each side to pick the one I felt was the nicest, which I'll make sure faces forward. Then I gave the whole thing a good sanding to remove the surface dirt and roughness. I noticed the top of the post had a slight bow, but the bottom had a dip and very prominent knot that I didn't want to have to deal with later, so I trimmed it off entirely. I made a mark at 43 inches, then set my miter saw to 22.5 degrees. I used my square to draw a cut line because sometimes it's a little hard to gauge when working with angles. This is the longest piece. The next 3 trapezoids are 7 inches, and that's taken from long point to long point. I wanted to keep the grain cohesive, so I wrote little F's on the front as not to lose track. Also, I found it easier to flip the post over and make my cuts rather than adjusting my miter saw back and forth. Here's the first piece. You can see how it will fit onto the main post. To make sure that the subsequent ones were exact, I set up a stop block to the right of my blade. This is always my preferred method for uniformity. The final piece is a bit longer at 8 inches. One side will have the 25.5 degree angle and the other side will be a straight cut. The 8-inch measurement is taken from the long point down. I laid all of the pieces out on my table and matched up the original order they were cut from so the grain patterns flow somewhat. I marked them as F1, F2, and F3. I used a couple different methods to attach the pieces, the first one being a biscuit joiner. I drew a line between each segment around the middle mark. You don't have to be exact. Besides the biscuits and wood glue, I also kept each segment from moving by shooting a couple 2-inch brad nails into each side. Be careful to avoid knots like the plague. I accidentally hit one and the brad nail flew off somewhere in my garage. I think it goes without saying to wear eye protection and keep your hands at a safe distance from the firing end. I probably could have stopped here, but I also added a long screw into each segment underside, right in the center area. I drilled a pilot hole first and buried the screw head into the post, then went back with wood filler, also hitting the brad nail holes and any knots. Once dry, I gave everything a final sanding. Next was white paint. I would have preferred to have given this a couple coats with spray paint, but it was raining outside, so I set up inside and used a roller brush. It took about 3 coats to adequately cover the post. While that was drying, I created a base. You'll need to choose something that's of substantial weight. I found these pieces of 3/4 inch oak left over from an old entertainment stand. I believe these were drawer and door fronts. After cleaning them up, I trimmed off the rounded edges on my table saw to about 1 inch in thickness. I plan to use these pieces later on, so I set them aside. Then I cut the larger piece to 13.5 by 13.5 and the smaller piece to 8 3/4 by 8 3/4. I typically choose whole numbers, but sometimes you have to work around variables that exist with the scraps you're using, like prior hardware holes or recessed drawer pulls. If you build your base close to this range, you will be okay. I wanted the edges to look a little more finished, so I chose the Roman OG bit for my router. I haven't had a chance to use this tool much, so my passes aren't exactly perfect, but it still looks pretty good. If you don't have a router, you could cut an angle to each edge or leave it as is with a blunt cut. You'll need to give the pieces a final sanding, and I evened out some of the mistakes I made at this point. Next, I found the center of each piece by drawing an X with the help of my square. Then I carefully drilled holes in each board, starting with a small bit and increasing it enough that I could slip a large nail up and through each piece. I noted which way the wood grain was running and also which sides looked the best. That way I can make sure they face forward. Then I added wood glue and tacked the 2 boards together with my 23 gauge pin nails. I also found the center of the post by drawing an X with my square, and I attached the base with a long screw and stood it up so I could verify that the candy cane wouldn't fall over. Then I began the process of using 2-inch wide painter's tape to create the stripes. This was definitely my least favorite part of the entire project. I placed my first piece of tape at an angle at the very bottom and methodically started wrapping it around the post using torn off little pieces as spacers in between rows. These will be removed before spray painting with red. They're just there as guides. Once I got the hang of it, I started a second full strip that will run the entire length of the post. In essence, the painter's tape is covering what will be the white stripes. I found it easier to work in increments than trying to wrap the entire thing in one long consecutive strip. When I got to the curved hook part of the candy cane, I changed my method and ended one of the consecutive strips of painter's tape in the underside in an area that doesn't show. Then I went with one strip the rest of the way. I think I redid this section 3 times until I found something I was happy with. Then I gave the entire piece a coat of white paint in an attempt to keep the subsequent red coat from bleeding under the tape. Next, I gave the candy cane 2 coats of red paint. When everything was dry, I started peeling off the tape, and I did not like how the curved section looked. It reminded me of a zebra, so I retaped the offending lines and repainted with red, hoping they would look a little bit more natural. Luckily, I was a bit happier with the results this time, but some of the red did seep under the painter's tape and needed fixed. I used white acrylic paint pens to touch up any areas that looked sloppy and a red Sharpie for any red areas that were not up to par. These methods covered the offending areas well, and I was left with an almost flawless finish. I was a bit conflicted on what to do with the base. I wasn't thrilled with covering this pretty oak, but didn't think it matched the look of the candy cane, so I ended up giving it and the trim pieces from earlier a coat of black paint. Then it was time to attach the base to the candy cane with a long screw. I don't know that I'll ever need to take the pieces apart, but wanted to leave myself with that option, so I attached the trim in a way that they're only glued and nailed to the base, not the post. For instance, if I need to mount the candy cane to something else down the road, I can easily remove it for versatility. And here's a look at the finished product. You can customize yours by adding hooks to hang stockings or embellishments like greenery, flowers, or bows. I might even put my house number down the front and set the candy cane decoration on my front porch. I'm really pleased with the outcome. Let me know what you think of this project in the comments. So I hope you enjoyed watching this candy cane come together, and I hope you're inspired to make one for yourself. Also, if you're not a current subscriber, I invite you to hit that follow button and look me up. You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook as well. As always, I thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.